Hello and good morning. Welcome to another meditation on the hard sayings of Jesus. And this hard saying is where that phrase hard saying comes from. In the King James Version, John 6:60, this is an hard saying, who can hear it? This is an hard saying, who can hear it? I'm going to read the few verses around it as well, just to put the context of it in and find out what the hard saying is. Because here Jesus says, eat my flesh and drink my blood. And that's the hard saying. John 6:52 onwards. Then the Jews began to argue sharply among themselves, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Jesus said to them, very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. On hearing it, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? Chapter 6 of John starts with Jesus being the most attractive man in Galilee. By the time we get to the end of chapter 6, he is the most repulsive man in Galilee. First he attracts the crowds, and then he repels them. So what's wrong with Jesus? Well, he was certainly not a repulsive character. He seems to have been an attractive personality. People were drawn to him. And his actions were not repulsive. He did so many good things. He healed the people. He released captives. He was really not doing anything repulsive. So what was it that made people turn against him? Well, it turns out to be the things he said. This is an hard saying. Who can hear it? And by the end of chapter 6, Jesus' popularity has gone down so much he's back to the original little knot of disciples. So why did he do it? Why did Jesus use such unpleasant language? Why did he speak in such, frankly disgusting physical terms as eating his flesh and drinking his blood? Well, we can't say that he was trying to avoid misunderstandings. In a way, he seemed to be making the misunderstandings worse. He knew that he was losing the crowd with this extreme language, but he just doubled down on it. All of the analogies I can think of for Jesus' behaviour in John 6 are gambling analogies. For instance, I would say Jesus is raising the stakes. He is doubling down. And in the end, he's like the man at the poker table who goes all in, pushing all of his chips into the centre of the table, banking everything on what might be a dodgy hand. He repeatedly says it in ways that are going to cause offence. Eat my flesh, drink my blood. Now cannibalism, and this is the language of cannibalism, cannibalism is a very extreme thing, isn't it? I only have heard of a few cases in modern times where people have been driven to cannibalism, and that was in the most extreme circumstances. In fact, many people have chosen to starve to death rather than eat the flesh of another human being. And those people who do resort to cannibalism in extreme moments carry that with them for the rest of their lives in terms of their own psychology and their social standing. So was it really necessary for Jesus to use such offensive language? Eat my flesh, drink my blood? Well, he says yes. And the reason he says it's necessary is because this is how you get eternal life. Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. So there is something like cannibalism that is necessary for us to have eternal life. If we want to share in the resurrection, we've got to do this thing, which he calls eating his flesh and drinking his blood. I think it reminds me that conversion to Christ, that is, that movement out of death to life, out of darkness to light, is always going to seem unpalatable to start with. Now, if you love Christ, as I do, if you enjoy fellowship with him and his church, as I do, it's very easy to forget that actually there was a moment when everything hung on a knife edge. It's hard to be converted. Jesus compares it with a camel going through the eye of a needle. You might say that's just for rich people. Well, actually, we're all rich here, so it's hard for any of us to be converted. It's easier to become a monk or a nun than really to be converted to Christ. In fact, I suspect there are some people hiding from God by living the life of the religious. People will do almost anything to avoid coming to Christ. My old mate Roy Scarsbrook used to tell a story about people stuck down a pit yelling up to the top, "Is there anybody there?" And eventually someone says, "Yes, what do you want? We need a rope." And a rope comes tumbling down out of the darkness into the darkness, and they yell up, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm Jesus Christ." And then they look at each other, and then they shout again, "Is there anyone else up there?" It's almost as if the fact that Jesus is the one offering salvation makes it more difficult. And I think that's a good little picture. I think it is hard to be converted. To be born again is just about as tricky and painful as the original being born. And people will avoid conversion. Something must happen between you and Jesus. And that thing is as difficult as eating his flesh and drinking his blood. You are what you eat, they say, and Jesus has to become your daily bread. He has to become part of you, and you have to become part of him. And there is no better language. I'm sure if there was, Jesus would have chosen it. You must eat his flesh. You must drink his blood. In other words, his death must become your death. His life must become your life. You must be joined to Christ as you are joined to your food. And so the language of eating flesh and drinking blood is not only appropriate, it's necessary. Now, you may have thought of the Lord's Supper here, where of course we do break bread and we drink wine. And yet I don't think Jesus is simply saying you've got to attend Holy Communion. What he's saying here is that reality of being joined to Christ, which communion shares with us, is the reality that has to be in your life. This is a hard saying. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. It is a hard saying, but it's a necessary one. And as Jesus says a couple of verses later, the Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I've spoken to you are full of the Spirit and life. Well, be blessed, and may you feed on Christ as you wait on him. Bye for now.